The grilled cheese sandwich from Route 9 Diner was still warm in Jake Morrison's hand when he pushed through the cafeteria doors at Ridgemont Elementary. He had called ahead to let them know he was coming, something the school secretary insisted was protocol, but that Jake suspected was really about making sure a man wearing a Hells Angels vest didn't surprise anyone who might panic first and ask questions later. The cafeteria smelled like industrial cleaner, fighting a losing battle against whatever passed for spaghetti in the public school system, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a particular frequency that made everything feel both institutional and permanent. Most of the children had already returned to class. The lunch rush, such as it was for a Tuesday in late September, had ended 20 minutes ago. Jake scanned the mostly empty space for his daughter, expecting to find her at one of the center tables where he had dropped her off that morning, chattering with whatever friends she had made in the 5 months since they had moved to Ashford. What he found instead was a scene that would replay in his nightmares for months afterward, every detail preserved with the terrible clarity of moments that break a person's understanding of the world. In the corner near the emergency exit, Lily Morrison was on her knees. 7 years old, wearing the purple sweater Sarah had bought her before she got sick, brown eyes that belonged to her mother staring at the institutional tile floor with the kind of focus that only comes from trying very hard not to cry. Her pink lunch tray lay upside down against the wall, its contents scattered across an area roughly the size of a body. A bruised apple that had rolled under a table. A sandwich crushed beyond recognition. White bread and what might have been turkey spread like evidence of violence. A carton of milk spreading white rivers across beige tile pooling in the grout lines that no amount of mopping ever truly cleaned. Standing over her was a boy, maybe 12 years old, broad-shouldered, in the way of children who hit puberty early and learned to use size as currency. He wore a smirk that Jake recognized from his own childhood, from every bully who had ever discovered that cruelty was a kind of power that adults rarely checked. The boy's voice carried across the nearly empty cafeteria with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced consequences. You people don't deserve real food. Pick it up. That's what you're good at. Lily didn't answer. She had learned somewhere, somehow, the economy of silence, how it could make danger pass for peace if you just made yourself small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough. Her hands trembled as she reached for a soggy piece of bread, fingers barely able to close around it. Jake watched his daughter, the child he had promised his dying wife he would protect above all else, picking her lunch off a cafeteria floor, while a boy 5 years older mocked her suffering. 10 feet away, arms crossed over a cafeteria supervisor's vest, Ms. Patricia Hayes stood watching, not intervening, not calling for help, not even pretending to be occupied with something else, just watching with the blank expression of someone who had made a decision long ago that certain battles were not worth fighting, that certain children were not worth protecting. Her silence was not neutral. It was permission. The grilled cheese slipped from Jake's hand. The sound of it hitting the floor should have been nothing barely audible in a space designed for hundreds of shouting children. But in that moment, in that particular configuration of violence, and witnessing it sounded like a gunshot. Everyone turned. The boy, Ms. Hayes, and Lily, whose face transformed from resignation to something far worse. Not relief that her father had arrived. Shame. The kind that makes a child believe she is the one who has been found wanting, that her suffering is evidence of her own inadequacy rather than someone else's cruelty. Daddy. The word came out small, stripped of everything except recognition and fear. He keeps doing this. He kicked my tray again. Again. The word hit Jake Morrison like a bullet finding flesh, like the moment when you realize that pain you thought was temporary has actually been destroying someone you love for longer than you could have imagined. His body responded before his brain caught up, every muscle tightening fists, clenching jaw, setting into the particular configuration that preceded violence. He could cross this room in 4 steps, could grab that boy by his collar, could lift him and shake him and make him understand what it felt like to be afraid to be small, to have someone with power decide that your suffering was entertainment. But Lily's eyes stopped him. Her expression held no hope that her father's arrival meant salvation. It held fear that his arrival meant escalation, that help would come with costs she could not afford to pay. She had seen enough of the world's cruelty in her 7 years, had lost her mother to cancer that devoured her from inside out over 6 months of treatments that promised hope, and delivered only prolonged dying to understand that rescue sometimes came with prices that destroyed as surely as abandonment. Jake turned his attention to Ms. Hayes, her arms uncrossed, slowly defensive posture activating as she registered the man in the leather vest, the Hells Angels patches that marked him as someone polite society had been taught to fear. Her voice came out thin, trying to project authority that her actions had already forfeited. Mr. Morrison, children will be children. Agnes needs to learn to stand up for herself. The words were so perfectly calibrated to dismiss his daughter's suffering that Jake felt something cold settle in his chest, something that would not be satisfied with shouting or threatening or any of the immediate responses his body demanded. He interrupted her with a question that came out quieter than he expected, stripped of anger, and therefore somehow more dangerous. How long? Ms. Hayes blinked. Excuse me, how long has this been happening? Her silence provided the answer more completely than any confession. Weeks, months, long enough that a 7-year-old child had learned to carry her suffering, like a secret long enough that adults had decided looking away was easier than intervention, long enough that the boy standing over scattered food understood that his actions carried no consequences. Jake Morrison did not yell, did not charge across the cafeteria, did not grab anyone by anything. Instead, he knelt beside his daughter and began helping her pick up pieces of what had been her lunch. His hands working slowly, carefully, as if this small act of restoration could somehow undo the damage that had accumulated over however many weeks or months his daughter had been quietly dying inside while he failed to see it. It's okay, baby girl. His voice came out thick with emotion he was barely containing. I'm here now, and this is never, ever going to happen again. He meant it with every cell in his body, though he did not yet understand how large that promise would need to become, how many people it would require to keep, how completely it would transform not just his life, but the entire small town that had decided his daughter's suffering was acceptable. Collateral damage in a system built to protect the powerful rather than the vulnerable. The boy Tyler Brennan pulled out his phone, started filming. His smirk widened into something uglier, something that spoke to calculation rather than impulse. My dad's gonna love this. Biker trash threatening a kid at school. Jake looked up slowly from the floor, still holding a piece of crushed sandwich, and met the boy's eyes. Saw in them not just cruelty, but strategy. The particular confidence of someone who had been taught that the rules bent around him, that adult protection was a shield that could be weaponized. This was not random bullying. This was orchestrated. This was a trap, and Jake had nearly walked directly into it by responding with violence that could be edited into whatever narrative served the people who had already decided his daughter did not matter. He stood carefully, helping Lily to her feet, keeping his voice steady, even though everything inside him was screaming. We're going home now, and then we're going to have a conversation about what happens next. Tyler continued filming as they walked out, his phone tracking their exit like evidence being collected for a trial that Jake did not yet understand he was already involved in. Ms. Hayes said nothing, her arms crossing again now that immediate confrontation had passed. The cafeteria returned to its empty humming, silence, fluorescent lights continuing their buzz, milk continuing to spread across institutional tile, and another day in the life of a school where certain children learned early and thoroughly that justice was not a thing they could expect. In the parking lot, Jake buckled Lily into his truck with hands that shook despite his best efforts to appear calm. She stared out the window, small shoulders hunched inward, and did not cry. The not crying was somehow worse than tears would have been. It spoke to suffering that had calcified into something harder, something that no longer expected relief. They drove home in silence, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the occasional crackle of Jake's radio clipped to his belt. He lived on the outskirts of Ashford, in a rental house that was neither nice nor terrible, just functional, in the way of temporary shelters that had somehow become permanent. The front yard needed mowing, the porch steps needed fixing. Everything about the place screamed transience, as if even the building understood that people who lived here were trying to forget something they could never quite leave behind. Inside, Jake made Lily a new sandwich. Grilled cheese the way she liked it, with the edges crispy and the center still gooey. She ate it mechanically without enthusiasm or complaint, the way soldiers eat field rations, because fuel is fuel regardless of enjoyment. He watched her, this small person who carried his stubbornness in Sarah's eyes, and tried to find words adequate to the situation. None came. How do you apologize for failing to protect someone when you did not even know they needed protection? How do you promise to fix something when the system itself is broken? After she finished eating, he carried her to her room, even though she was probably too old for that now, too big to be lifted and cradled like a toddler. But she did not protest, just wrapped her arms around his neck and let herself be small in a way she apparently could not allow herself to be anywhere else. He tucked her into bed despite it being only 3 in the afternoon, pulled her crescent moon nightlight from the closet and plugged it in, and sat on the edge of her mattress while she stared at the ceiling as if answers might be written there in glow-in-the-dark stars. How long, baby girl? His voice came out gentle, careful walking on glass because he suspected the answer would shatter something fundamental. The pause stretched so long that Jake thought she might not answer. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, thin as paper and just as fragile, she said what he had been dreading. Since the first week. 5 months. His daughter had been tormented for 5 months while he made her breakfast, packed her lunch, drove her to school, told her to have a good day. 5 months of quiet suffering that he had mistaken for grief over losing her mother, for adjustment to a new town, for the normal difficulties of being 7 years old in a world that felt increasingly hostile to childhood itself. 5 months while he was building motorcycles and drinking with his brothers and trying to stitch together some semblance of a life from the ruins Sarah's death had left behind. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out fractured, split down the middle by guilt and incomprehension. Lily turned her head on the pillow, brown eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. Because Mommy said you'd protect me, and I didn't want you to fight. I didn't want you to get in trouble. I didn't want to lose you too. The words detonated something in Jake's chest. His 7-year-old daughter trying to protect him, carrying the weight of systematic cruelty in silence because she had already watched cancer steal her mother and could not bear the thought that standing up for herself might cost her the only parent she had left. She had shouldered months of suffering alone because she loved him, because she was brave in ways that had nothing to do with fighting back and everything to do with enduring what felt unendurable. He gathered her into his arms, held her with desperate tenderness, felt her small body shake with sobs she had been holding back for months. You're never going to lose me, Agnes. Never. But I need you to tell me everything, every single thing. Can you do that? She nodded against his chest and the story came out in pieces, fragments of systematic destruction delivered in a child's vocabulary. Tyler Brennan was the worst but not the only one. There were others: Madison Walsh, Connor Cooper, Sophia Martinez, Ethan Henderson. 5 children who moved through Ridgemont Elementary like royalty, untouchable, protected by parents who sat on school boards and police forces and county benches. They called Lily orphan girl and biker trash and dirty boots as if cruelty were a language they had been raised in. They tripped her in hallways, knocked books from her arms, poured water on her chair so she had to sit in humiliation or stand out by refusing to sit. But Tyler Brennan, he had made the lunch tray his signature act, would wait until Lily sat down, then walk past with practiced timing, a slight adjustment of his path, a quick kick that sent food and dignity scattering across institutional tile. Lily had learned to eat quickly, to hide in corners, to hope that invisibility might protect her if compliance did not. It never did. The cruelty was not about her actions. It was about her existence, about being the wrong kind of person in a place that had decided certain children mattered and certain children were acceptable targets. And the adults. That was what made Jake's blood turn cold, what transformed anger into something harder and more focused. Lily had told teachers, had told lunch monitors, had told the school counselor, Dr. Michelle Park, a woman who seemed kind, but whose kindness apparently stopped where institutional pressure began. Every single time the response was the same. Try to avoid him, don't react, and he'll stop. Boys will be boys. Each phrase another stone placed on a child's shoulders, another message that her suffering was normal, expected something she should learn to manage rather than something that should be stopped. Jake felt something in him crack open, not rage exactly, but something older and deeper, the sense of a promise trembling under unbearable weight. Why didn't anyone help you? Lily's answer came after a hesitation that spoke to fear of saying too much, of revealing things she had been taught through silence not to speak. Because his dad is Mr. Brennan, David Brennan, and Mr. Brennan runs everything. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. David Brennan, school board president, local real estate developer. The man whose face appeared on bus stop benches and grocery store bulletin boards, whose name was attached to half the new construction in Ashford, whose donations funded school programs, and whose influence bent institutions to his will. This was not a case of a school not knowing. This was a case of a school deciding not to act because the cost of acting was higher than the cost of a 7-year-old child eating her lunch off the floor. When Lily finally fell asleep, her breathing evening out into the soft rhythm of exhausted children, Jake stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. Pulled out his phone, started making calls. Parents' first numbers he had collected over 5 months of school pickups and fundraisers and forced small talk with people who had seemed pleasant enough on the surface, but who apparently understood something about Ashford that he was only now beginning to grasp. The picture that emerged sharpened with each conversation. Tyler Brennan had 12 documented complaints over 3 years. 12. And nothing meaningful had ever happened. A detention here that lasted 1 period. A suspension that was overturned after a single phone call. Other parents had pushed harder, hired lawyers, threatened to go to the media. Their concerns were dismissed with lines about exaggeration or misinterpretation or boys being boys. Some found their complaints simply disappeared from official records as if documentation itself could be erased by the right phone call from the right person. Teachers had tried to intervene. 3 were reassigned to less desirable positions. 1 lost her job under the vague banner of performance issues that coincided suspiciously with her filing a formal complaint about Tyler's behavior. Dr. Michelle Park, the school counselor, who seemed genuinely to care, had attempted to escalate an incident to the district level. She was told to consider whether she was misinterpreting normal developmental behavior, a warning that carried implications about her judgment and therefore her continued employment. But Tyler Brennan was not alone. That was the revelation that transformed this from a story about one bully into something far more insidious. Tyler ran with 4 other kids: Madison Walsh, whose mother was the school superintendent; Connor Cooper, whose father was the police chief; Sophia Martinez, whose mother was the town mayor; Ethan Henderson, whose father was a county judge. The 5 families' parents whispered with the kind of careful neutrality that spoke to fear of being overheard. They controlled Ashford at every institutional level: school board, police department, municipal government, court system, real estate development. Between them, they had sewn up every mechanism of power, and accountability had transformed a small Texas town into their personal fiefdom. Jake Morrison sat at his kitchen table at 2 in the morning, phone dark mind racing through implications that grew more disturbing with each connection he traced. Going to the principal would not fix this because the principal answered to a superintendent whose daughter was protected by the same system. Filing a complaint would not work because complaints were reviewed by a school board president who had the most to lose. Calling the police was pointless because the police chief's son was part of the problem. Even going to court meant facing a judge whose child benefited from the status quo. The rot ran deeper than paperwork and polite conversations. The system was not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, protecting the children of people with power while teaching everyone else's children that justice was not a thing they could expect. Jake pulled a box from the hall closet one he had been avoiding since they moved from Arizona. Inside were Sarah's things, the items he had not been able to throw away, but also could not bear to look at. Photographs from their wedding, her nursing textbooks, the apron she wore at Sweet Haven Bakery with flour stains that would never wash out, and beneath those at the bottom, a journal he had forgotten existed. He opened it carefully as if the pages might crumble under scrutiny. Sarah's handwriting, precise and familiar dates spanning the 3 months before her diagnosis. Most entries were mundane: bread recipes, customer interactions, notes about Lily's development. But the final entries, dated just days before she suddenly became sick, carried a different tone. Met with Dr. Park at Ridgemont today. She says there are 5 kids being systematically protected, board members' children, all complaints disappear, teachers reassigned or fired, parents intimidated. I need to document everything before the entry ended abruptly. No period, no signature, just words cut off mid-thought as if Sarah had been interrupted or had run out of time or had decided the thought was too dangerous to complete. Jake turned the page. Nothing. The rest of the journal was blank. He sat staring at his dead wife's handwriting until the words blurred, until his vision tunneled, and his breathing became something he had to consciously control. Sarah had known. Before they ever moved to Texas, when they were still in Arizona, somehow Sarah had known about Ridgemont Elementary and its corruption. She had been investigating, and then she had gotten sick. Stage 4 lung cancer, the doctor said. Aggressive. Unusual in a woman who had never smoked, who ran marathons, who ate organic and meditated and did everything right. It consumed her in 6 months faster than the oncologist expected, resistant to treatments that should have worked. They told Jake it was bad luck, genetic lottery, one of those terrible things that happened for no reason at all. But what if it was not bad luck? What if it was not random? Jake's hands shook as he pulled up Sarah's medical records on his laptop, files he had not looked at since her death, because looking meant reliving, and reliving meant drowning. He read through diagnoses and treatment notes and pathology reports with the particular focus of someone searching for something he hoped not to find. The timeline troubled him. Sarah had been healthy. Then within days of that final journal entry, she started coughing. Within a week, she could barely breathe. Within 2 weeks, they had a diagnosis that should have taken months to develop. The cancer had been too fast, too aggressive, too conveniently timed. And Sarah, who had been investigating corruption in Ashford, Texas, had died in Mesa, Arizona before ever testifying about what she had found. Jake closed the laptop before he could follow that thought to its logical conclusion, before he could articulate the suspicion crystallizing in his mind. Because if he articulated it, if he gave it words, he would have to act on it. And acting on it would mean accepting that his wife had been murdered, that Lily had lost her mother not to random cellular malfunction, but to systematic evil, that the promise he made at Sarah's deathbed was bigger and more dangerous than he had understood. He did not sleep that night. Could not. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, watching dawn break over Ashford, through windows that needed washing, thinking about his daughter who had eaten her lunch off a cafeteria floor, while adults watched, thinking about his wife who had died investigating corruption that now threatened their child, thinking about a system so thoroughly poisoned that reform felt impossible. But Jake Morrison had learned something in 20 years riding with the Hells Angels. Impossible just meant you needed more people, needed brothers, needed a pack that moved together and protected its own with the kind of loyalty that institutions could never muster, because institutions serve power while brotherhood served people. At 6 in the morning, he got in his truck and drove to the Devil's Highway Diner. The diner sat on the edge of Ashford, where the town proper gave way to empty land and long highways, a building with peeling paint and neon that buzzed like a dying insect, and parking spaces perpetually filled with motorcycles lined up like loyal sentries. To most people driving past, it looked like trouble waiting to happen, like the kind of place where bad decisions were made and worse ones celebrated. To Jake, it was home, the unofficial headquarters of the Hells Angels Texas chapter, the only place he knew he could go when a problem was too big for one man to carry alone. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and motor oil and old stories, the particular atmosphere of places where men gather not because they have to, but because they choose to, because shared history creates obligations that outlast any legal contract. Victor Hawk Coleman sat in his usual booth in the back corner, a mountain of a man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen both violence and miracles that carried the particular gravity of someone who had lost everything and built something new from the ruins. 20 years ago, Hawk had buried his daughter, Emma, 7 years old, killed by a drunk driver who ran a red light and shattered a family in the instant it takes for metal to meet flesh. The grief had broken him for years, had sent him spiraling into anger and alcohol, and every self-destructive behavior men turn to when pain becomes unbearable. But eventually, slowly and possibly, he had climbed out of that darkness and transformed his loss into purpose. Now he led the chapter not with cruelty, but with fierce protective instinct for anyone vulnerable, anyone hurt, anyone who reminded him of the daughter he could not save. Jake approached the booth, and Hawk looked up from his coffee, studied Jake's face for half a second before asking the only question that mattered. What happened? Jake told him everything. The cafeteria, the bullying, the teacher who stood by doing nothing, the 5 months his daughter had suffered in silence, the 5 families who controlled every institution in Ashford, the 12 documented complaints that had gone nowhere, the teachers who lost their jobs for trying to help. And finally, his voice breaking on the words Sarah's journal entry and the terrible suspicion that his wife had not died of cancer but had been murdered for investigating the same corruption that now threatened their daughter. Hawk's jaw tightened. His coffee sat forgotten as Jake's words poured out, building a picture of systematic cruelty that transformed a small town into a kind of prison for anyone without the right last name. When Jake finished, silence settled over the booth, heavy and expectant. "You sure you want to bring the club into this, brother?" Hawk's voice was rough but careful, recognizing the magnitude of what Jake was asking. "Going public changes everything. Changes us. I don't want to." Jake heard his own voice stripped of pride or pretense. "But I need to. The school board is rigged. The police are compromised. If I go in alone, they'll bury this. They've been burying it for years." Hawk leaned back, the vinyl booth creaking under his weight. "What exactly are you asking for?" Jake had thought about this during the long night, had run through every scenario and possibility until he arrived at the only strategy that made sense. Not violence, not intimidation, something larger, something impossible to ignore. Witnesses. I want 200 of us to show up at the school board meeting next week. I want cameras there. I want reporters asking questions. I want everything they've been hiding to have nowhere left to hide. The Hells Angels have a reputation. Fear and respect in equal measure. I want to use that. Not to threaten, to illuminate. Hawk nodded slowly, understanding the calculation. "You're not asking for war." "No," Jake met his eyes. "I'm asking for justice. And justice takes a hell of a lot more people than war does." That night, Hawk called an emergency meeting. Word spread through the chapter with the particular speed of important news, and by 9 p.m., nearly 100 members had gathered at the Devil's Highway Diner. They filled the booths and lined the walls and spilled out into the parking lot, men and women who had lived hard lives and rebuilt themselves piece by piece, who wore their mistakes as visibly as their tattoos, who understood better than most that redemption was not a destination, but a daily choice. Jake stood before them and told Lily's story, told them about the kicked trays and the taunts and the bruises no one had cared to ask about, told them about the teacher who watched and did nothing, told them about the 12 documented complaints ignored by a system built to protect the powerful rather than the vulnerable. He told them about the 5 families and their stranglehold on every institution that should have protected his daughter. And then he spoke of Sarah, his wife, the promise he made to her, the promise he was on the verge of breaking if he did not act now. The room was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional scrape of a boot against linoleum. Jake pulled out Sarah's journal, opened it to that final entry, and read it aloud so everyone could hear what his wife had been investigating before she died. When he finished, when he looked up from the page, he saw his own grief and rage reflected in 100 faces. There is a moment in every story where everything after shifts, where the tide turns, because one choice is made with absolute conviction. This was that moment. The vote was unanimous. 200 Hells Angels would ride to Ridgemont Elementary, not for violence, for visibility, for truth, for the kind of accountability that institutions fear because it demands honesty. But this was not going to be a mob descending on a school. Hawk began assigning roles with the precision of someone who understood that strategy mattered more than numbers. That organization was the difference between meaningful action and performative gesture. 3 members with law degrees would form a legal team, gathering and reviewing every piece of documentation they could find. Carol Torres, a former journalist who had traded reporting for writing after her paper was bought out by a corporation that cared more about clicks than truth, would serve as media liaison, ensuring the narrative could not be twisted before the facts were clear. A logistics coordinator would oversee the demonstration mapping routes, ensuring compliance with local laws, preventing even the appearance of aggression. And a select group would take on the most delicate job of all, speaking to other children and families, gathering testimonies from anyone else who had been silenced by fear or influence. This was not rage. This was not retaliation. This was strategy, precise and purposeful, and designed to accomplish what individual complaint letters and polite meetings had failed to do for years. As the meeting broke up, members filtering out into the night to spread the word and begin preparations, Mason Wrench Cole pulled Jake aside. Wrench was 35, a mechanic who could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, a brother Jake had known for 5 years and trusted completely. But tonight, something in Wrench's expression made Jake uneasy, a nervousness that did not match the situation's gravity. "Brother, I need to tell you something." Wrench's voice came out too loud, as if he was trying too hard to sound casual. "About David Brennan, he's not just corrupt, he's dangerous. 3 years ago, a teacher who reported him car accident. Never walked again. You sure you want to do this?" Jake studied Wrench's face in the parking lot darkness, trying to read what lay behind the warning. It felt off, somehow too specific, too detailed, as if Wrench had practiced the delivery. "I'm sure," Jake kept his voice neutral. "We're not doing anything illegal, just standing up for what's right." Wrench nodded, but something in his posture remained tense. "Just be careful, man. These people play for keeps." As Jake drove home, that conversation replayed in his mind. Why had Wrench's warning felt rehearsed? Why had he mentioned that specific detail about the car accident? And why, if he was genuinely concerned, had he waited until after the vote to express those concerns rather than voicing them during the meeting, when his objections might have swayed others? The questions followed Jake into his house, through his nighttime routine, into the fitful sleep that finally claimed him around 3 in the morning. He dreamed of Sarah alive and well, standing in her bakery kitchen with flour dusting her arms. She was trying to tell him something, but her voice would not carry her mouth moving without sound. Behind her, shadows gathered in the doorway, taking shape into figures he could not quite see. Sarah turned toward them, raising her hands as if to ward them off. And then Jake woke with a gasp, his own apartment ceiling replacing dream imagery. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation. The legal team fanned out across county records offices, pulling every piece of documentation they could find about David Brennan and his associates. What they discovered was even worse than Jake had imagined. The 5 families had been systematically embezzling from the school district for nearly a decade, using their positions to approve contracts with companies they secretly owned, inflating costs and pocketing the difference. Medicorp, the company that supplied the school clinic, was charging 3 times market rate for basic supplies. The construction company that had renovated the gymnasium 2 years ago had billed for materials never used. The food service provider was owned by a shell corporation that traced back to David Brennan's wife. In total, they had stolen over $500,000 from a school district that could barely afford textbooks, let alone the programs they claimed to support with their generous donations. The donations were not generosity. They were cover a way to appear philanthropic while looting public funds. But when the legal team tried to access original documents to pull the actual contracts and invoices that would prove embezzlement, beyond reasonable doubt, they discovered something troubling. The files were gone, not missing, not misfiled, deleted. Someone had scrubbed the digital records and removed the physical copies from archive storage. Someone with access to county systems. Someone who knew what the Hells Angels were looking for before they started looking. Jake stared at the legal team's report at the gaps where evidence should have been and felt cold certainty settle into his bones. There was a leak. Someone in the chapter had tipped off David Brennan. Someone had betrayed them. He thought about Wrench's warning, about the too specific detail of the car accident, about the nervous energy that did not match a brother expressing concern. And he made a decision that felt like betrayal, even as he knew it was necessary. He would watch Wrench, carefully, quietly. And if his suspicions were correct, if his brother had sold them out for whatever reason, moved men to abandon their oaths, Jake would deal with it in a way that protected the chapter and the mission, while offering Wrench a chance at the redemption they all claimed to believe in. On the 3rd night after finding Lily in the cafeteria, Jake woke to orange light flickering across his bedroom ceiling. For a moment, confused and disoriented, he thought he had left a candle burning. Then he smelled smoke. Then he heard the roar of flames consuming wood and insulation and 20 years of accumulated tools and motorcycle parts. His shop was burning. Jake ran outside in boxer shorts and undershirt phone, already dialing 911, watching flames pour through the windows of the garage where he had rebuilt engines and fabricated custom parts and earned the money that kept him and Lily fed. The fire department arrived within minutes, but by then the building was fully engulfed heat so intense that firefighters could not get close enough to save anything meaningful. They called it an electrical fire. Faulty wiring in a building that was older than Jake and had never been properly updated. Tragic accident. These things happened. Insurance would cover most of it. Just be glad no one was hurt. But Jake knew with bone-deep certainty that this was no accident. This was a message from David Brennan: back off or lose more than a building. This was what happened to people who challenged the five families. This was the price of resistance. As Jake stood in his front yard at 4 in the morning, watching firefighters spray water onto Ash and ruin, his phone rang. Hawk's voice came through, rough with sleep and urgency. "I heard. You and Lily okay?" "We're okay. Building's gone, but we're okay." This was them. Hawk did not make it a question. Yeah, this was them. Then they just declared war. Hawk's voice hardened into something Jake recognized from old stories from before the chapter had decided to leave certain behaviors behind. "Let's show them what war with angels looks like." Jake ended the call and walked through the debris that had once been his livelihood, his phone's flashlight beam cutting through darkness and smoke. Near what used to be his workbench, something caught his attention. Fabric partially burned, but with enough intact to be recognizable. A Hells Angels bandana, the kind members wore to mark tools or bikes or territory. Someone from the chapter had been here. Someone had left this behind, either intentionally as a message or accidentally in the rush to escape before flames drew attention. The bandana was not Jake's. The pattern was wrong. The wear marks different. This belonged to someone else. Someone who had access to the shop. Someone who knew where Jake kept his spare key for emergencies. Jake picked up the bandana, carefully preserving what evidence he could. His mind ran through possibilities, through brothers who knew where to find this key, through people who would have both motive and access to set a fire that looked accidental. The list was short. 3 people, maybe 4. And at the top of that list, the name Jake did not want to write, but could no longer ignore: Mason Wrench Cole, his brother, his friend for 5 years, the man who had warned him about David Brennan's dangerousness with rehearsed urgency, the man who had been making phone calls during meetings, who had seemed nervous in ways that went beyond normal concern. The man who had access to Jake's shop, who knew the building's layout, who would have known exactly where to start a fire that would burn fast and hot and destroy everything before firefighters could intervene. Jake stood in the ruins of his livelihood, holding evidence of betrayal, and made a choice. He would not confront Wrench yet, would not accuse or threaten or do anything that might drive the traitor deeper underground or alert David Brennan that they knew about the leak. Instead, he would watch, would wait, would gather evidence until he could not only prove Wrench's betrayal, but understand why it had happened and whether redemption was possible, or if some betrayals were too complete to survive. As dawn broke over Ashford, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that mocked the destruction below, Jake Morrison called Hawk back with a message that was both promise and declaration. "They burned my shop. They think that'll stop us. It won't. Tell everyone we ride in 48 hours, 200 strong, and we're not asking for justice anymore. We're demanding it." Hawk's response was simple: "See you in 48 hours, brother. And Jake, we're going to make sure your little girl never has to pick her lunch off the floor again." The pieces were in place. The brothers were gathering. The evidence was being compiled despite efforts to destroy it. In 48 hours, 200 Hells Angels would descend on Ridgemont Elementary, and the 5 families who had controlled Ashford for a decade would discover that some things could not be intimidated, could not be bought, could not be burned away. Some things, like a father's promise to his dying wife, like a community's commitment to protecting its children, like the particular code of brotherhood that said, "You defended the vulnerable even when defense cost you everything." Those things were stronger than corruption, more enduring than institutional power, more fearsome than any threat wealthy men could devise. Jake Morrison did not know yet that his wife had been murdered, did not know yet that Mason Wrench had been on David Brennan's payroll for 6 months, feeding information and sabotaging resistance, did not know yet that Sheriff Dale Crawford was Brennan's brother-in-law, or that the confrontation coming would draw national attention and change not just Ridgemont, but the public perception of motorcycle clubs across the country. But he knew enough, knew that his daughter deserved better, knew that Sarah's investigation had not died with her, knew that sometimes justice required not the violence society expected from men like him, but the courage to stand in daylight and demand truth from people who had grown comfortable with lies. In her bedroom, Lily Morrison slept peacefully for the first time in 5 months, the guardian angel pin that Elena Stitch Rodriguez would give her 2 days later, already waiting in a jewelry box at the Devil's Highway Diner, prepared by brothers and sisters who understood that protecting a child sometimes meant showing her she was not alone, that an army stood ready to defend her, that the world was bigger and kinder than the small, cruel corner of it she had been forced to inhabit. The storm was gathering. The angels were preparing to ride. And Ashford, Texas was about to learn that darkness cannot survive when enough people decide to turn on the light. Jake Morrison woke before dawn on the day that would change everything, that hour when darkness feels most absolute and the world holds its breath, waiting for light that might not come. He had not slept more than 2 hours, his mind cycling through contingencies and worst-case scenarios, through everything that could go wrong, when 200 bikers descended on an elementary school in a town that had already demonstrated its willingness to burn buildings and destroy lives to maintain the status quo. He checked on Lily first, the way he had every morning since Sarah died, needing to confirm, through direct observation, that his daughter still breathed, still existed, still occupied space in a universe that had proven itself capable of stealing people without warning or mercy. She slept curled beneath her blanket, the crescent moon nightlight casting gentle shadows across her face. For a moment, watching her, Jake felt something approaching peace. Whatever happened today, whatever consequences followed from the choice he had made to bring his brothers into this fight, at least Lily would know that someone had tried, that her suffering had mattered enough to someone to risk everything. He dressed in darkness, or pulling on jeans and his cleanest shirt, the leather vest with Hell's Angels patches that he wore like armor and identity in equal measure. The vest smelled like motor oil and old leather and decades of accumulated stories from brothers who had worn it before him, who had passed it down like an inheritance that carried obligations along with pride. Today, those obligations would be tested in ways Jake could not fully anticipate, but he understood enough to know that once they crossed this threshold, once they made this stand in public view, there would be no returning to the quiet anonymity that had protected them for years. He drove through empty streets toward the staging area on Ashford's eastern edge, a half-abandoned parking lot where the Hells Angels often gathered before long rides. What he found there stopped him with the particular force of moments when abstract planning becomes concrete reality, when numbers on a page transform into human beings, making choices that will define them. 200 motorcycles lined the asphalt in perfect formation, chrome catching the first hints of approaching dawn. But it was not the machines that struck Jake breathless. It was the people. Victor Hawk Coleman stood at the front, massive and unmovable, carrying the quiet gravity of someone who had lost a daughter and vowed never to let another child fall through the cracks the way Emma had. Beside him stood Elena Stitch Rodriguez, still wearing her pediatric scrubs under her vest, having just finished an overnight shift at the county hospital, where she had stitched wounds and set bones and whispered comfort to frightened children whose parents could not afford better care. Robert Gospel Miller was there too, the former pastor who had left the church but never abandoned the conviction that his purpose was service, even if he now served from behind handlebars instead of a pulpit. And beyond them, scores more. Men and women the outside world dismissed as outlaws, as misfits, as the dangerous sort. But Jake saw them clearly in that moment. Mechanics and nurses and teachers and veterans and single parents. People who had survived hard lives without allowing those lives to harden their hearts, who had made mistakes and paid for them, and now chose every day to be something better than their worst moments. This is what the world never sees, Jake thought. They see leather and tattoos and engines that sound like controlled explosions. They don't see the pediatric nurse who works double shifts to pay for her mother's chemotherapy. They don't see the former pastor who still prays under his breath for strangers he passes on the road. They don't see the fathers and mothers who have been broken and rebuilt themselves piece by piece, who understand better than most what it means to need protection because they remember when no one protected them. 200 flawed human beings, each one deciding on this cold morning to be a shield for a 7-year-old girl most of them had never met. Hawk raised his hand. The signal was simple, but its effect was profound. 200 engines roared to life simultaneously, the sound rolling across empty land like thunder caught in metal cages, like the voice of something ancient and implacable announcing its presence. The noise rattled windows miles away, vibrated through the bones of people who heard it, sent dogs barking and lights flickering on in neighborhood houses where residents emerged onto porches to see what catastrophe had announced itself before sunrise. The formation pulled out in disciplined rows, tight and smooth, practiced from years of riding together through celebrations and funerals and everything between. Jake rode beside Hawk at the front, the two of them leading a river of chrome and leather that stretched half a mile behind them, that moved through Ashford like a procession with purpose that transcended anything the town had witnessed before. People emerged from diners and gas stations and front porches as the motorcycles passed. Some waved, caught up in the spectacle, without understanding its meaning. Others stared with phones held high, recording footage that would be uploaded to social media within minutes. That would begin the transformation of narrative from local trouble to national story. A few looked uneasy, unable to reconcile the intimidating display with the disciplined silence of riders who revved no engines unnecessarily, who made no threatening gestures, who simply moved with a united purpose toward a destination everyone in Ashford would know about before the sun fully rose. By 6:45, the procession arrived at Ridgemont Elementary. The school sat back from the main road, a low brick building constructed in the 1970s, when optimism about public education still translated into adequate funding and architectural ambition. Now it looked tired, paint peeling from window frames, playground equipment rusting in the morning dew, the whole structure radiating the particular exhaustion of institutions asked to do too much with too little for too long. The motorcycles did not surround the school, did not block entrances or parking spaces. Instead, they filed one by one into the overflow lot across the street, each rider finding a position with military precision until 200 bikes stood in perfect rows gleaming in the strengthening light. Engines died until only silence remained, profound and deliberate. 200 bikers climbed off their machines and simply stood there, not moving, not shouting, not threatening, just present, standing, waiting, watching. Inside the school, panic erupted with the speed of institutions discovering their carefully constructed control has evaporated. Principal Sandra Walsh glanced out her office window, saw the sea of motorcycles and leather-vested figures, and turned pale in a way that suggested her blood had actually drained from her face, rather than simply redistributing. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the phone, nearly dropping it twice before managing to dial. "There's a gang outside," she said into the receiver, her voice climbing toward hysteria. "Hundreds of them. I need officers here now." 4 squad cars arrived within 7 minutes, lights flashing red and blue against the gray dawn, sirens off, because even the responding officers understood that noise would escalate rather than calm. Sheriff Dale Crawford stepped out of the lead vehicle, one hand resting near his belt, where his service weapon sat holstered, eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of suspicion and something that might have been curiosity. He was 48 years old, 20 years in law enforcement, and he had seen his share of motorcycle club activity. But this was different. This was organized. This was peaceful. This was, despite the intimidating numbers, completely legal. Hawk walked forward slowly, hands clearly visible at his sides, moving with the particular care of someone who understood that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted by nervous officers whose training emphasized threat assessment over nuance. He stopped 10 feet from the sheriff and waited until Crawford acknowledged him with a slight nod before speaking. "Sheriff Crawford." Hawk's voice was deep but measured, stripped of aggression. "My name is Victor Coleman. We're here to attend the emergency school board meeting this afternoon. Until then, we'll be waiting here peacefully to ensure the safety of the children as they arrive, particularly one child named Lily Morrison." Crawford studied him, taking in the gray beard and the scars and the patches that announced allegiance to an organization the sheriff had been taught to view as criminal enterprise. "You planning on causing trouble?" "No, sir." Hawk's response was immediate and respectful in ways that subtly challenged the sheriff's assumptions about who deserved courtesy. "But we're planning on shining a light on trouble that's already here. Trouble that's been here a long time while people in positions of authority looked the other way." Something flickered in Crawford's eyes, some recognition that landed and was immediately suppressed. He glanced back at his officers, then at the school, calculating odds and optics in real time. "We'll be watching," he said finally. "Any hint of violence, any intimidation of students or staff, and you're all going to jail." "Understood," Hawk nodded. "We're here to protect children, Sheriff. Same as you." The sheriff returned to his vehicle but did not leave, instead parking where he had clear sight lines to both the school and the bikers settling in for what promised to be a long day. The other squad cars took similar positions, creating a perimeter that was either protective or threatening depending on perspective. As parents began arriving for morning drop-off, confusion rippled through the parking lot like wind through grass. Cars slowed, drivers craning to see what had assembled across the street. Some turned around immediately, deciding that whatever was happening, their children should not be present for it. Others parked and walked their kids to the entrance with hands held tight and eyes watching the bikers with poorly concealed fear. Jake spotted his truck in the line of vehicles. Lily buckled into the passenger seat, her face pressed to the window as she tried to understand what she was seeing. He had told her only that some friends wanted to make sure she was safe today, that she should not be afraid no matter what happened. Now, watching her eyes go wide as she registered the scale of what her father had mobilized on her behalf, he wondered if he had prepared her adequately or if some things were simply too large for advance warning. He walked to the truck and opened Lily's door, helping her down with hands that were steadier than he felt. She held her backpack tight to her chest, the protective gesture of children who have learned that safety is provisional and can evaporate without warning. Jake took her hand and began walking her toward the school entrance. And then something happened that would etch itself into Lily Morrison's memory with the permanence of moments that redefine understanding of the world and one's place in it. As she passed each biker, they straightened, not with intimidation but with honor. Some nodded in quiet respect. Others pressed a hand to their hearts in a gesture that transcended words. They were acknowledging her, seeing her, offering recognition that her suffering had mattered, that she was not invisible or disposable or acceptable collateral damage in a system built for someone else's benefit. Elena Stitch Rodriguez stepped forward from the line, dropping to one knee so she was eye level with Lily. Up close, Lily could see the exhaustion in Stitch's face from the overnight shift, could see the faded coffee stains on her scrubs, could see the gentleness in eyes that had witnessed suffering but refused to become callous by it. "You must be Lily." Stitch's voice was warm despite the cold morning. "I'm Elena, but everyone calls me Stitch. I'm a nurse and I want you to know something important. You are brave. What you've been going through would break most grown-ups, but you're still standing. That makes you one of us." She pulled something from her pocket, a small pin no bigger than a quarter. A guardian angel with tiny wings, the metal warmed from Stitch's palm. "Wear this today. And whenever you're scared, whenever you feel alone, remember you've got 200 people out here who've got your back. We're not going anywhere." Lily took the pin with trembling fingers and fastened it carefully to her sweater. The weight was negligible, but the meaning was immense, transforming her from isolated victim into someone protected, someone who mattered enough that strangers would stand in the cold before dawn on her behalf. She looked up at her father, then at Stitch, then at the 200 bikers standing in silent formation, and something in her posture changed. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted fractionally. For the first time in 5 months, she walked into Ridgemont Elementary, not trying to make herself invisible. Within minutes, whispers rippled through hallways with the speed of wildfire in drought conditions. Teachers peered through blinds. Students exchanged wide-eyed looks and urgent speculation. Lily Morrison, the quiet girl who ate lunch alone and never made eye contact, had arrived with an army. The girl everyone ignored or tormented or pretended not to see had become suddenly unmistakably visible. And in that visibility, something else began to happen. Other children started to step forward. By second period, 3 students had approached Lily carefully, as if proximity to her might transfer either protection or target status depending on how the day resolved. "Is it true?" one whispered, a girl named Emma, whose lunch money Madison Walsh had been taking for months. "All those bikers, they're really here for you." Lily, still processing her own transformation, repeated the words her father had taught her. "They're here for anyone who needs them." By lunchtime, 6 more kids had gathered around her table in the cafeteria, forming a group that felt less like friendship and more like mutual defense, like survivors recognizing each other through scars that remained invisible to everyone else. They had stories. Marcus, whose glasses Tyler Brennan had broken 3 times. Daniel, whom Connor Cooper had beaten up behind the gymnasium, while his police chief father made sure no report was ever filed. Sophia, who had been systematically excluded from every group project and social event by the mayor's daughter who shared her name. Tyler Brennan himself had not appeared at lunch. Word spread that his mother had kept him home, that Karen Brennan had seen the motorcycles and made a decision that suggested fear overriding her husband's authority. The absence of the school's primary tormentor changed the atmosphere in ways both subtle and profound. Children who normally walked hunched and hypervigilant moved with fractionally more ease. Laughter emerged tentatively from corners where it had been suppressed. The cafeteria felt different, as if the removal of one element of threat had exposed how much collective fear had been shaping everyone's behavior. But Tyler's absence also meant something darker. It meant David Brennan knew what was happening. It meant the five families were preparing their response. It meant the confrontation everyone had been anticipating was not a question of if, but when and how. That answer arrived just after noon, announced by the rumble of engines that carried a different note than the disciplined arrival of the Hells Angels. 30 motorcycles riding aggressive and loud, weaving through traffic with deliberate recklessness, announcing their presence, not through organization but through chaos. They wore different colors, different patches. Iron Riders MC, a club that had none of the Hells Angels' evolution toward community service, that remained committed to the original outlaw ethos of drugs and violence, and the kind of masculinity that confused cruelty with strength. The Iron Riders parked provocatively close to the Hells Angels formation engines, revving unnecessarily, riders climbing off with swagger that broadcast threat. Their president, a man who went by Snake, despite being christened Vincent Torres 45 years ago in a hospital 3 miles from where he now stood, approached Hawk with the particular confidence of someone who believed might made right and that sufficient aggression could compensate for being outnumbered 6-1. Brennan says you should leave. Snake's voice carried across the parking lot, meant to be overheard by everyone present. Says this isn't your business. Hawk did not move, did not rise to the bait, did not give Snake any excuse to claim provocation. It became our business when a 7-year-old girl got hurt on our watch. Snake smiled without warmth. Your funeral. His threat was not subtle, was not meant to be. David Brennan had hired the Iron Riders to do what the sheriff could not legally accomplish: create a situation where the Hells Angels would either leave voluntarily or react with violence that would justify their arrest. The tension that settled over the parking lot was thick enough to choke on. Two motorcycle clubs, historically antagonistic, now facing each other, with an elementary school between them and cameras recording everything. Sheriff Crawford watched from his vehicle, making no move to intervene, no gesture toward keeping the peace. His inaction spoke volumes about whose side he was actually on. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, keeping his attention split between the screen and Snake's provocations. The message that appeared made his blood stop moving, made his vision tunnel, made everything except the image on his screen fade into irrelevance. A photograph. His rental house. Lily's bedroom window. And visible through that window, captured by someone with a telephoto lens or who had gotten close enough to shoot through glass. Lily's empty bed, the crescent moon nightlight, her stuffed animals arranged on the pillow. The accompanying text was brief and devastating. Back off or accidents happen, even to little girls. Jake's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the phone. Rage flooded through him, hot enough to burn, demanding action, demanding he cross the distance to Snake and make him reveal who had sent this threat and where they were, and whether Lily was actually in danger or if the photograph was simply meant to terrify. But Hawk's hand landed on his shoulder, gripping hard enough to hurt, anchoring Jake to the present before he could do something that would destroy everything they had built. That's what they want. Hawk's voice was barely audible, meant only for Jake. Reaction, violence on camera, don't give it to them. Jake forced himself to breathe, to think past the primal urge to protect that was screaming at him to grab his daughter and run until they found somewhere safe. Even though he knew intellectually that nowhere was safe, that running would not solve the systemic problem, that the only path forward required standing exactly where he stood and refusing to be moved. The rest of the day passed in stretched tension hours that felt like weeks, every moment pregnant with potential violence that never quite materialized. The Iron Riders remained in the parking lot, making noise and threats, but taking no action that would justify intervention. The Hells Angels maintained their silent vigil, refusing engagement, demonstrating through stillness the discipline that separated them from the chaos Snake represented. And inside the school, children attended classes in an atmosphere electric with awareness that something unprecedented was happening just beyond their walls. At 3 p.m., as students began filing out for afternoon dismissal, Jake saw Lily emerge with her new group of friends surrounding her like a protective formation they had unconsciously adopted. She still wore the guardian angel pin, still walked with shoulders that no longer curved inward. And when she saw her father waiting by the truck, saw the 200 bikers who had not moved in 9 hours, her face broke into a smile that made every moment of tension worth enduring. That night, the Hells Angels legal team returned from their day combing through county records with evidence that was both damning and incomplete. They had found proof of embezzlement, of contracts approved by school board members for companies they secretly owned, of money flowing from school district accounts into private pockets. But the original documents, the paper trail that would make conviction inevitable, rather than merely probable, had been scrubbed from the system. Someone had known what they were looking for. Someone had removed evidence before it could be collected. Jake gathered the core group at the Devil's Highway Diner after dark, when the parking lot was full of motorcycles, but empty of the crowds that daytime would bring. Hawk Stitch Gospel, Carol Torres, the media liaison, James Chen, the attorney, and 20 others whose roles in the coming confrontation required coordination and clear communication. Someone tipped them off. Chen's frustration was evident in the way he pushed papers across the table. The gaps in evidence circled in red like wounds. We had a 2-day window before the board meeting. Brennan couldn't have known we were looking unless someone told him. The traitor question hung in the air unspoken but understood by everyone present. Jake thought about the burned shop, about the bandana he had found, about Wrench's nervous energy and 2 specific warnings, about the phone calls during meetings that stopped whenever someone got too close. He had been watching Wrench for 3 days now, noting patterns, documenting behavior, waiting for confirmation before making an accusation that would shatter brotherhood and possibly destroy a man who might still deserve the chance at redemption they all claimed to offer. The confirmation came at 10 p.m., delivered not through surveillance, but through Wrench's own inability to maintain the deception. Jake saw him slip out the diner's back entrance, saw him walk to his bike with the particular purpose of someone who had somewhere to be and did not want company. Jake followed, keeping distance, watching as Wrench rode not toward home, but toward the gas station 3 miles outside town, the one with broken security cameras, in a parking lot that offered privacy for transactions that required discretion. David Brennan's black Mercedes was already there when Wrench arrived. Jake watched from the tree line as Wrench dismounted and approached the car, as Brennan's window rolled down as an envelope passed from one man to the other. The exchange took less than 30 seconds. Wrench stuffed the envelope inside his vest without counting. Whatever it contained, spoke briefly to Brennan, then returned to his motorcycle and rode away without looking back. Jake's heart broke watching this, understanding with terrible clarity that his brother, his friend for 5 years, had been selling them out, had been feeding information to the enemy, had probably burned Jake's shop on Brennan's orders, had endangered Lily and Sarah's investigation and everything they were trying to accomplish, all for money, whose amount Jake could not know but suspected was far less than the cost of the betrayal. He returned to the diner and pulled Hawk aside, showed him the photographs he had captured on his phone, watched Hawk's face cycle through disbelief and rage and grief that mirrored Jake's own. They agreed to confront Wrench privately, to give him the chance to explain before making his betrayal public, to offer the redemption their code demanded, even when every instinct screamed for harsher justice. The confrontation happened in the diner's back room, just Jake and Hawk and Wrench, the door closed against curious ears. Wrench knew immediately why they had called him there. His face went pale, then red emotion cycling too fast to catalog as he understood that his deception had been discovered. How long? Hawk's question was simple, but weighted with everything unspoken about brotherhood and loyalty and the cost of betrayal. 6 months. Wrench's voice came out small, stripped of the confidence he usually projected. He approached me after I got a DUI, said he could make it disappear if I kept him informed about club business. Said it was just intelligence gathering, nothing that would hurt anyone. Jake felt rage building but forced it down, forced himself to ask the question that mattered more than anger. Did you burn my shop? Wrench's silence was answer enough, then barely audible. He said it needed to look like an accident. Said you'd back off if you understood what was at stake. I'm sorry, Jake. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't rebuild what you destroyed. Jake heard his own voice cold and level. Sorry doesn't protect my daughter from the threats you enabled by telling Brennan our plans. I didn't know about the threats. Wrench looked up, desperation evident. I swear I didn't know he was threatening Lily. He told me it was just about protecting his son, about keeping the school board functioning, about maintaining order. I didn't realize how deep the corruption went until the legal team started finding evidence of embezzlement. Hawk's next question was the one that would determine Wrench's fate within the club and possibly beyond. What else did you tell him? Wrench's confession poured out with the relief of someone who had been carrying weight too heavy for too long. He detailed every conversation with Brennan, every piece of information passed along, every strategy shared before it could be implemented. The list was devastating. Wrench had told Brennan about the legal team's plans, about the document search that led to evidence being destroyed, about the witnesses they had interviewed, who were subsequently intimidated into silence. He had given Brennan advance warning of nearly every move the Hells Angels had planned, allowing the five families to stay ahead of exposure. But then Wrench offered something that shifted the calculation, that transformed him from simple trader into something more complicated. He pulled out his phone, opened a recording app, played audio files he had been secretly capturing during his conversations with David Brennan. Brennan's voice emerged from the small speaker, tinny but clear, discussing evidence destruction and witness intimidation with casual confidence that assumed Wrench's loyalty. In one recording, Brennan discussed Sarah Morrison, directly acknowledging that she had been investigating the school board and had needed to be stopped. He did not explicitly confess to murdering her, but the implication was clear enough that Jake felt his world tilt sideways, felt the suspicion he had been nurturing harden into terrible certainty. Why? Jake forced the question past the rage choking him. Why record him if you were working for him? Because I knew it was wrong. Wrench looked at them with eyes that held genuine remorse alongside the fear of consequences. I told myself I was just feeding him harmless information, that no one would really get hurt, that the money was worth the minor betrayal. But the more I learned about what he'd done, about the kids he'd heard about Sarah, I realized I wasn't just betraying the club. I was helping someone truly evil. So I started documenting everything, thinking maybe I could use it to make things right eventually. Hawk took the phone, scrolled through the recordings, his expression unreadable. This changes things. Doesn't change that he betrayed us. Jake's anger had not subsided. Doesn't change that my shop burned or that my daughter was threatened. No, Hawk agreed, but it means he can help us win. These recordings, they're evidence of conspiracy, of obstruction of justice, possibly of Sarah's murder. They're what we need to take Brennan down completely. They made Wrench an offer that was both merciful and calculated. He would provide all recordings and testimony, would cooperate fully with both the Hells Angels investigation and any subsequent legal proceedings. In exchange, they would not turn him over to law enforcement immediately for arson, would give him the chance to make genuine amends by helping expose the corruption he had enabled. But he was out of the club, immediately. No ceremony, no appeals. Just the stripping of his patches and the understanding that brotherhood had limits even when redemption remained possible. Wrench accepted with visible relief, pulling off his vest and handing it to Hawk like a soldier surrendering weapons after defeat. He left the diner that night alone, riding away from the only family he had known for 5 years, carrying the weight of choices that could never be fully undone, but might, with sufficient effort and honesty, eventually be balanced by better ones. The school board meeting convened at 6 p.m. on Thursday, 5 days after Jake had found Lily on the cafeteria floor in a room designed to hold 50 people that now contained over 300. Bodies filled every seat, lined the walls, spilled into hallways, and out onto the sidewalk, where speakers had been hastily set up to broadcast proceedings to the overflow crowd. The Hells Angels stood throughout, clean shirts and polished boots and leather vests, 200 silent witnesses whose presence transformed the meeting from routine bureaucratic process into something approaching a trial. The five families sat at the board table, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the room filled beyond capacity. David Brennan, in the center, jaw clenched, fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that betrayed nervousness he was trying to suppress. Superintendent Gerald Walsh to his right, pale and sweating despite the air conditioning. Police Chief Marcus Cooper Heyer, Sophia Martinez, and Judge Harold Henderson completing the line, each one projecting an authority that was beginning to crack under the weight of scrutiny they had not faced in years. Sheriff Crawford stood at the back door, ostensibly providing security, but actually serving as David Brennan's insurance policy, his presence a reminder that law enforcement remained aligned with power rather than justice. The meeting opened with procedural language meant to establish normalcy, to pretend that this was just another community forum, despite the unprecedented crowd and the cameras recording everything for audiences far beyond Ashford. David Brennan's voice carried false confidence as he welcomed everyone and invited public comment, apparently believing he could control narrative through parliamentary procedure and carefully manage time limits. But the testimonies, when they began, carried weight that procedure could not contain. A mother stood first, her voice cracking, as she described her son being shoved into lockers for months, how she had filed reports that mysteriously disappeared, how she had been told repeatedly to give it time, that boys would be boys, that her concerns were being addressed even as nothing changed. Another parent followed, then another, years of ignored pleas flooding into the room like water through a broken dam. There were tears, trembling hands, the shaking breath of people who had carried their children's hurt in silence, and were finally being given space to speak it aloud. Then came the students themselves. Marcus, 12 years old, with glasses repaired with tape after Tyler Brennan had broken them for the third time, described being called slurs and being told by the counselor to consider whether he was doing something to provoke it. His voice wavered, but he did not back down, did not let shame or fear prevent him from naming what had been done to him. Emma spoke about Madison Walsh systematically stealing her lunch money, about hunger that had nothing to do with family poverty and everything to do with theft that adults chose not to see. Daniel told the board about Connor Cooper beating him behind the gymnasium, while the police chief's son's friends filmed it, about showing the bruises to teachers who suggested he was exaggerating, that he should avoid situations that led to conflict. The room held its breath for each testimony, creating space for suffering to be acknowledged in ways that transformed individual pain into collective understanding. These were not isolated incidents. This was a pattern, systematic and protected, enabled by adults who had decided that certain children's suffering was acceptable cost for maintaining relationships with powerful families. Two former teachers took the microphone, next, women who had been terminated for attempting to report what they witnessed. They testified to pressure to modify grades for the 5 families' children, to warnings not to discipline certain students, to sudden terminations framed as performance issues that coincided suspiciously with their refusal to participate in corruption. Their words were steady but heavy, carrying the particular authority of people who had paid prices for attempting to do the right thing. And then Jake Morrison stood. The room went silent, with the completeness of people recognizing that this testimony would be different, that the father whose daughter had been found on her knees in the cafeteria would either give voice to collective rage or demonstrate restraint that might shame those who had failed to protect her. "My wife made me promise to protect our daughter." Jake's voice filled the room without shouting, decades of commanding motorcycles and wind teaching him projection. "I thought that meant keeping her fed, keeping a roof over her head, teaching her right from wrong. I didn't realize it would mean fighting an entire system that had decided she wasn't worth protecting." He paused, letting the truth settle. "My daughter spent 5 months eating her lunch off the floor because a boy 5 years older than her thought it was funny. And the adults who were supposed to protect her, the teacher, the counselor, the principal, this board, you looked the other way." David Brennan leaned into his microphone, trying to interrupt, trying to regain control of narrative that was slipping away. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you're upset, but bringing a motorcycle gang." Jake cut him off with a look that silenced more effectively than words. "Some of you are angry we're here. You think this is intimidation. But let me tell you something about intimidation, Mr. Brennan. Intimidation is what my 7-year-old felt every single morning walking into your school. Intimidation is being told her suffering doesn't matter because the boy tormenting her has a father who controls the budget. We're not here to intimidate. We're here to say it stops. Tonight." The applause that erupted was thunderous, sustained, transforming the boardroom into something that felt more like a revival meeting than bureaucratic process. David Brennan's face flushed red, his carefully maintained composure cracking as he realized that control had passed irreversibly from his hands to the crowd that refused to be managed or silenced. Carol Torres stood next, the former journalist whose media training had taught her how to deliver information in ways that could not be dismissed or ignored. She held up documentation binders, thick folders containing evidence the legal team had compiled. Inside, she announced to the cameras as much as to the board, were records of systematic bullying cover-ups, of complaints that disappeared, of teachers terminated for reporting the truth. And she added her voice-hardening evidence of financial corruption involving all 5 families at this table. She began listing specifics: Metacorp contracts at 3 times market rate. Construction projects billed for materials never used. Food service contracts awarded to shell corporations that trace back to board members' relatives. Between the 5 families, over $500,000 stolen from a school district that claimed poverty while approving raises for administrators and kickbacks for themselves. David Brennan stood abruptly, chair scraping backward with sound that cut through Carol's testimony. This is slander. You can't prove any of these allegations. We can. James Chen stood, attorney credentials and legal language lending weight to accusations that might otherwise be dismissed as conspiracy theory. We have contracts, financial records, testimony from district employees who were pressured to approve questionable spending. What we don't have are the original documents that were removed from county archives 3 days ago by someone with high-level access, someone who knew we were looking. He let that hang for a moment before continuing. But we do have something else. We have recordings of David Brennan discussing evidence destruction, witness intimidation, and the need to silence people who ask too many questions, including recordings that mention Sarah Morrison by name, acknowledging that she had been investigating the school board and needed to be stopped. The room erupted, shouting, gasping, people rising to their feet with demands for answers. Jake felt his vision narrow to a pinpoint focused on David Brennan's face, watching emotions cycle through denial and rage and fear in rapid succession. Carol began playing audio from Wrench's recordings, Brennan's voice filling the boardroom with admissions that destroyed any pretense of innocence. Sheriff Crawford moved toward the front, hand on his weapon, and Jake understood with terrible clarity that Crawford was not moving to arrest Brennan, but to end the meeting before more damage could be done. The sheriff was family, Jake remembered. Brennan's brother-in-law. The corruption extended even deeper than they had imagined. But before Crawford could reach the front, before he could perform whatever intervention Brennan expected, the back doors crashed open and 30 Iron Riders poured in, Snake leading them with swagger that announced this was planned. Intimidation, this was Brennan's nuclear option when legal mechanisms failed. Brennan paid us to clear you out. Snake's announcement was not even subtle, was not meant to be. Either you leave or we make you leave. The tension that had been building all evening crystallized into something approaching violence, into the moment where everything could pivot toward chaos that would undermine every carefully constructed strategy. 200 Hells Angels stood slowly, not reaching for weapons, but simply rising, demonstrating through unified movement that they would not be moved by hired thugs regardless of the consequences. Hawk stepped into the space between the two groups, massive and calm, speaking with voice that somehow carried despite not shouting. You're going to shoot unarmed people in front of 50 cameras, in front of children. The question hung there, exposing the absurdity of Brennan's strategy, revealing that violence would only confirm everything the Hells Angels had been saying about corruption and abuse of power. Snake hesitated, calculation visible on his face as he realized that Brennan had put him in an impossible position. And then, cutting through the tension like lightning through darkness, a voice from the side of the room broke the standoff. Stop. All of you stop. Karen Brennan stood with hands shaking, face streaked with tears, body trembling with the effort required to speak against the husband who had controlled her for decades. Everyone froze, turning toward this woman who had been so silent for so long that her voice felt like thunder, despite being barely above a whisper. I need to tell the truth. Karen walked toward the front, moving like someone who had finally decided that survival was worth the cost of honesty. David doesn't just protect Tyler from consequences. He's the reason Tyler is the way he is. She pulled up her sleeve with movements that suggested she had practiced this, that she had known this moment would come and had prepared for it. Bruises covered her forearm, some fresh and purple, others faded to yellow-green, evidence of ongoing violence that had been hidden beneath long sleeves and careful makeup. David beats me. Karen's voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking the truth after years of silence was feeding something in her that had been starving. He beats Tyler. Tyler bullies because that's what he's been taught. That power means hurting people weaker than you. That consequences don't apply if you have the right last name. She looked at Lily Morrison, at the 7-year-old girl with the guardian angel pin, whose suffering had finally pulled the darkness into light. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I saw what Tyler did. I wanted to stop it, but I was too scared of what David would do to me, to Tyler, if I interfered. David Brennan lunged at his wife, rage overwhelming the careful control he had maintained throughout the meeting. Four Hell's Angels moved simultaneously, intercepting him before he could reach Karen, restraining him with care that was neither gentle nor excessive, simply effective. Sheriff Crawford moved toward them, hand reaching for his weapon, and Hawk's voice cut through the chaos. "We're protecting a woman from her abuser. You gonna arrest us for that?" The question delivered in front of cameras broadcasting nationally stopped Crawford cold. He could not arrest them without becoming complicit in domestic violence, could not defend Brennan without destroying his own career. He stood frozen, hands still near his weapon, as the world watched him choose between family loyalty and the oath he had sworn 20 years ago. Karen continued, her voice carrying confessions that would reverberate far beyond this room. "And Sarah Morrison, the woman who died, David poisoned her. She was investigating him, gathering evidence of the embezzlement and the bullying cover-ups. He put arsenic in her bakery supplies over the course of months, made it look like aggressive lung cancer, made everyone believe it was natural." The words hit Jake Morrison like physical blows, like confirmation of suspicions he had been nurturing but hoping were wrong. His wife had been murdered. Lily's mother had been killed not by random cellular failure, but by calculated evil designed to protect corruption that continued destroying children years after Sarah's death. He felt his knees weaken, felt the world tilt, felt Hawk's steadying hand on his shoulder, as grief and rage competed for dominance. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Reporters shouting questions, parents demanding immediate arrests, Hell's Angels surrounding Karen Brennan to protect her from her husband, who was screaming threats even as he was restrained. Sheriff Crawford on his radio calling for backup that would arrive too late to control a situation that had already passed beyond any possibility of containment. And somewhere in that chaos, in that moment, when decades of corruption finally cracked open, Lily Morrison stood on her chair and shouted with voice that carried farther than anyone would have expected from someone so small. "My mommy didn't die for nothing. Everyone listen. My mommy died trying to help kids like me. And now everyone knows the truth." The room went silent. 300 people, 2 motorcycle clubs, 5 corrupt officials, and a sheriff who had chosen the wrong side, all stopped and looked at a 7-year-old girl who had suffered in silence for 5 months and was now refusing to be silent for even one moment more. She held up the guardian angel pin. "Stitch gave me this. She said I'm brave. And I am brave, because I told the truth even though I was scared. And now all of you have to be brave too. You have to stop letting bad people hurt kids just because they have power." In that moment, in a 7-year-old child's demand for justice, the balance shifted irreversibly. David Brennan and his co-conspirators would face arrest before the night ended. Sheriff Crawford would lose his badge. Karen Brennan would find safety and eventually peace. And Ashford, Texas would begin the slow work of transforming from a town where power protected itself to a community where children mattered more than institutions. But none of them knew that yet. In this moment, they were simply witnesses to the instant when enough light flooded a dark place that darkness could no longer survive, when a father's promise to his dying wife finally began to find fulfillment, when 200 angels riding for justice discovered that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most power to change the world. The chaos in the boardroom continued for 17 minutes before FBI agents arrived, called by a reporter whose instinct for federal jurisdiction had proven sharper than local law enforcement's commitment to justice. Special Agent Michelle Torres entered with 6 other agents, their presence instantly shifting the atmosphere from mob fury to something more controlled, more methodical, more inevitable. She surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency. David Brennan restrained by Hell's Angels. Karen Brennan sobbing in protective custody of women whose leather vests marked them as people society had taught her to fear. Sheriff Crawford frozen in paralysis between duty and family loyalty. And 300 witnesses whose phones had captured every moment of confession that would be inadmissible in court, but devastating in the court of public opinion. "Federal jurisdiction," Agent Torres announced to the room, her voice cutting through residual noise. "Corruption of public officials, embezzlement of federal education funds, conspiracy to obstruct justice. Everyone stays exactly where they are while we sort this out." The sorting took hours. Statements were collected from dozens of witnesses. Karen Brennan was transported to a safe house with federal protection. Her testimony too valuable and her danger too real to risk leaving her in Ashford, where her husband's influence might reach even through bars. David Brennan and Sheriff Dale Crawford were arrested on preliminary charges that would multiply as investigators untangled the full scope of corruption. The other members of the five families, Superintendent Walsh Police Chief Cooper Mayor Martinez and Judge Henderson, were taken into custody as material witnesses, their freedom provisional, on cooperation that none of them could afford to refuse. Jake Morrison sat in a plastic chair in the elementary school hallway, Lily asleep with her head in his lap, and tried to process the truth that had detonated his understanding of the past 18 months. Sarah had been murdered. Not taken by random cellular malfunction, but killed deliberately poisoned over months, in a way designed to look natural, eliminated because she had threatened powerful people with exposure of crimes they had committed against children. His wife had died protecting kids she never met, and he had spent a year and a half believing it was just terrible luck. Just the universe's cruelty. Just one of those things that happened for no reason at all. The grief was complicated by rage, by guilt that he had not seen the truth sooner, by the terrible recognition that Sarah had hidden her investigation from him deliberately because she knew he would have tried to stop her, would have prioritized her safety over justice for children who were not their daughter. She had chosen to risk herself, and that choice had cost Lily her mother and Jake, his wife, in the world a woman whose courage had ultimately sparked the transformation now beginning. Hawk found him there at 2 in the morning, the school long since cleared, except for investigators still processing the scene. "You should go home, brother. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Jake looked up at him. This man who had lost his own daughter and had spent 20 years trying to fill that hole with protection of other people's children. "How do you do it? How do you keep going? And after you lose someone like that?" Hawk sat heavily beside him, the plastic chair creaking under his weight. "You don't get over it. You get through it. One day at a time. One choice at a time. You decide that their death doesn't get to be the end of their story, that you're going to carry forward what they believed in, even when it hurts more than you thought you could survive." He looked at Lily sleeping peacefully despite the chaos that had surrounded her. "You got a reason to keep going right there. Sarah gave you that gift. Don't waste it by drowning in grief when you could be building something that honors what she died for." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice, and carried Lily to his truck. She stirred only slightly as he buckled her in, murmuring something about guardian angels before settling back into sleep that was deeper and more peaceful than anything she had managed in months. The drive home was silent except for the rumble of the engine and the occasional crackle of Jake's radio as brothers checked in, confirming everyone had made it home safely, that the night had ended without the violence they had all feared. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of media attention that transformed a local story into national news. The footage of Karen Brennan revealing her bruises of her confession about Sarah Morrison's murder of a 7-year-old girl standing on a chair demanding justice spread across every news platform and social media feed with the particular virality of stories that challenge comfortable assumptions. The Hells Angels, historically portrayed as dangerous outlaws, were suddenly being depicted as community protectors, as fathers and mothers and nurses and teachers who had mobilized peacefully to defend a child when institutions failed her. The narrative shift was profound and uncomfortable for media outlets that had built decades of coverage around the idea that motorcycle clubs represented pure threat. Now they were forced to reconcile that assumption with images of Elena Stitch Rodriguez in pediatric scrubs giving a traumatized child a guardian angel pin, with Robert Gospel Miller leading prayer circles for Karen Brennan's safety, with 200 people standing in cold dawn for 9 hours without incident to ensure that one little girl could walk safely into school. The story reached beyond Ashford, beyond Texas, sparking conversations about systemic corruption in small towns, about the ways that wealth and power insulate certain children, while exposing others to systematic cruelty, about the failure of institutions to protect the vulnerable, when doing so might inconvenience the powerful. Within a week, 3 other Texas school districts had contacted the Hells Angels asking about implementing similar oversight programs. Within 2 weeks, a state legislator had announced plans to introduce Sarah's Law, requiring independent audits of school board finances and protecting whistleblowers who reported corruption. But for Jake and Lily, the media attention was something to endure rather than celebrate intrusion into grief and trauma that required processing in private rather than performance for cameras that wanted sound bites and emotional reactions. Jake kept Lily home from school for a week, both of them needing time to adjust to a world that had transformed overnight, from one where Sarah's death was tragic but natural to one where it was murder that demanded justice alongside grief. They established new routines. Morning walks before breakfast, evening conversations on the porch swing, therapy twice a week with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a counselor who specialized in childhood trauma and who understood that healing required patience rather than pressure, that Lily needed space to process at her own pace, rather than being rushed toward recovery that looked good on paper but felt hollow in practice. The nightmares came as expected manifestations of trauma that had been suppressed for months and was now expressing itself in dreams, where Lily was chased by shadows she could not see, where she tried to call for help, but found her voice did not work, where she picked up food from endless floors and cafeterias that stretched to infinity. Jake learned to recognize the signs, to wake her gently and hold her while she cried, to remind her that she was safe, that she was loved, that the people who hurt her were facing consequences and could not reach her anymore. 3 weeks after the school board confrontation, the first major trial began. David Brennan faced multiple charges in federal court: embezzlement of public funds, conspiracy to commit fraud and witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and most seriously, first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Morrison. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Financial records documented the embezzlement. Recordings from Wrench's phone captured Brennan discussing evidence destruction and witness intimidation. And Karen Brennan's testimony, delivered with careful courage from behind a screen that protected her from having to face her husband, directly detailed years of abuse and the specific conversations about Sarah Morrison that amounted to confession of premeditated murder. The defense attempted to paint Karen as a scorned wife, seeking revenge, to suggest that the Hells Angels had fabricated evidence or coerced testimony to argue that arsenic poisoning could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt given the time that had passed since Sarah's death. But the exhumation of Sarah's body had revealed arsenic levels that confirmed chronic poisoning over months, and the testimony of the medical examiner who had originally diagnosed cancer documented symptoms consistent with poisoning that had been misinterpreted as aggressive malignancy. Jake attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with Hawk beside him and Lily with her grandmother in Arizona, who had flown in to help care for her while her father pursued justice for her mother. The testimony was devastating, transforming abstract understanding of what had happened into concrete details that made the crime undeniable. Expert witnesses explained how arsenic could be introduced into food supplies, how symptoms would mimic cancer progression, how Sarah would have suffered without knowing why. Karen described finding receipts for arsenic purchases that David had hidden in his office, described conversations where he discussed the Morrison problem and how it needed to be resolved before she could provide evidence to authorities. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts: guilty of embezzlement, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of obstruction, guilty of first-degree murder. David Brennan showed no emotion as the verdict was read, his face a mask that revealed nothing except perhaps the recognition that the careful construction of power and influence he had built over decades had collapsed completely in the space of 3 weeks. The sentencing came 2 days later. The judge, a federal appointee with no connection to Ashford's compromised legal system, spoke directly to Brennan before announcing the sentence. "You were entrusted with the welfare of children, and you betrayed that trust in the most fundamental ways. You used your position to steal from families who trusted you, to protect bullies, including your own son, to silence anyone who threatened to expose your crimes. And when Sarah Morrison came close to revealing the truth, you murdered her in a way calculated to avoid detection. The harm you caused is immeasurable. The lives you damaged cannot be fully restored. But justice demands consequences proportionate to crimes. 25 years to life on the murder charge, 10 years consecutive for embezzlement, 5 years consecutive for obstruction. No possibility of parole. David Brennan, 73 years old when eligible for parole consideration, would almost certainly die in prison. The other members of the 5 families received sentences that reflected their levels of culpability. Sheriff Crawford got 15 years for corruption and obstruction. Superintendent Walsh got 10 years for embezzlement and conspiracy. Police Chief Cooper Mayor Martinez and Judge Henderson each received between 5 and 8 years, their careers destroyed and their influence evaporated. Ms. Patricia Hayes, the cafeteria supervisor who had watched Lily's suffering and done nothing was terminated from the school district and banned from working in education, though no criminal charges were filed since her sin was inaction rather than direct participation in crimes. Mason Wrench Cole, the Hells Angel, who had betrayed his brothers but ultimately provided the recordings that sealed Brennan's conviction, received a suspended sentence for arson in exchange for his cooperation. He was ordered to perform 500 hours of community service and to remain out of contact with the Hells Angels chapter, his exile permanent, even if his legal freedom was provisional. The last Jake heard, Wrench had moved to Oklahoma and was working construction, trying to rebuild a life from ruins of his own making. 2 months after the trial, Jake and Lily returned to Ridgemont Elementary for the first time since that chaotic board meeting. The school had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. New principal, new board members elected in special elections with campaign promises focused on transparency and accountability. New policies requiring multiple witnesses to any disciplinary action, requiring documentation of all complaints, requiring independent review of any situation involving children of board members or administrators. But more than policy changes, the atmosphere had shifted. Teachers moved with less fear, more confidence that supporting students would not cost them their jobs. Children walked hallways with shoulders less hunched, with voices less carefully modulated, with the particular ease of people who no longer expect punishment for existing. The cafeteria where Lily had knelt picking up scattered food had been completely renovated, with funds raised by the Hells Angels. New tables, new lighting, fresh paint in warm colors that made the space feel less institutional and more welcoming. Elena Stitch Rodriguez had spearheaded the renovation, working with the school to design spaces that felt safer and more inclusive. But her greatest contribution was the program she helped establish in collaboration with Hawk and the rest of the chapter, Angels Watch and Volunteer Initiative, where vetted members of the Hells Angels took shifts, supervising morning drop-offs, afternoon pickups, lunch periods, and after-school programs. Their presence was both practical and symbolic. Practical because their visibility deterred the kind of casual cruelty that had flourished in shadows, because children who felt unsafe could approach an adult whose job was protection rather than education or administration, because parents who had reason to fear retaliation for reporting problems now had allies outside the school's institutional structure. Symbolic because it demonstrated that the community's most marginalized members, people society had dismissed as criminals or troublemakers, could be protectors, could be trusted, could transform stereotypes through consistent demonstration of care and competence. The statistics told the story more clearly than any narrative could. Bullying reports dropped 78% in the first 6 months of Angels Watch, not because incidents were being hidden, but because the culture had shifted to one where cruelty was no longer tolerated or ignored. Student attendance increased 15% as children who had been avoiding school out of fear discovered that Ridgemont was becoming a place where they could learn rather than merely survive. Teacher retention improved dramatically with the departure of administrators who had punished honest reporting and the installation of leadership committed to supporting staff who prioritized student welfare. Other Texas school districts took notice. Within 6 months, 3 had adopted variations of the Angels Watch model. Within a year, 12 districts across 5 states had implemented similar programs, each one adapting the core principles to their local context while maintaining the fundamental commitment to having visible, trained, non-institutional adults whose primary role was child protection and whose presence reminded everyone that the community was watching and would no longer tolerate systematic failure to defend the vulnerable. Tyler Brennan's journey was more complicated than simple redemption arcs allowed. After his father's arrest and his mother's placement in protective custody, Tyler was evaluated by child psychologists who documented extensive trauma consistent with years of physical and emotional abuse. His bullying had not been random cruelty, but learned behavior, the replication of violence he had experienced at home, the acting out of power dynamics that had been his normal his entire childhood. He was removed from Ridgemont and enrolled in Meadowview Academy, a specialized school for trauma survivors, where therapy was integrated into daily life rather than being an add-on to traditional education. The work was hard and slow, and frequently involved setbacks where old patterns reasserted themselves, where Tyler would lash out or withdraw, or demonstrate behaviors that had been reinforced for 12 years and could not be eliminated quickly, no matter how much he intellectually understood they were wrong. But 4 months into intensive treatment, Tyler wrote letters to every child he had bullied. The letters were not assigned by therapists, but initiated by Tyler himself, his way of taking responsibility for harm he had caused, even though he had also been victimized. The letter to Lily Morrison was delivered through Jake Tyler's therapist, wanting to ensure that Lily had adult support when reading words that might trigger trauma, even as they offered apology. Jake read the letter first, sitting alone in his kitchen after Lily had gone to bed, needing to evaluate whether this was genuine remorse or manipulation that would cause additional harm. The letter was handwritten on lined paper, words carefully formed in handwriting that suggested Tyler had written multiple drafts before arriving at this final version. Dear Lily, I know sorry isn't enough. I know what I did was terrible and that saying I'm sorry doesn't erase the hurt I caused you. But I want you to know that I am sorry more than I can express in a letter. For 5 months, I made your life miserable. I kicked your tray. I called you names. I made you feel small and scared every day. That was wrong. There's no excuse for it, no justification that makes it okay. My therapist says I hurt you because I was hurt by my dad. He beat me a lot. He told me that strong people hurt weak people, that you were weak because your dad is a biker and your mom died, that I needed to make your life hard because your family was trash. I believed him because I was scared of what would happen if I didn't do what he wanted. But that doesn't make what I did okay. You didn't deserve any of it. You were just trying to go to school and learn and be a kid. I took that away from you. I made you scared every morning. I made you eat lunch off the floor. I gave you nightmares. I'm in therapy now. I'm learning that being hurt doesn't give me permission to hurt others. I'm learning that real strength is kindness, not cruelty. I'm learning to recognize when I'm repeating patterns my dad taught me and to choose different behaviors even when the old ones feel natural. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not sure I deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that I see what I did clearly now. I'm ashamed of who I was, and I'm working every day to become someone better. I hope someday you can be happy again without the shadow of what I did hanging over you. I hope you can go to school without being afraid. I hope you can trust that not everyone who hurt you will keep hurting you. You were braver than I ever was. You stood up and told the truth even when it was scary. Because of you, my dad can't hurt anyone anymore. Because of you, I'm getting help I needed but didn't know how to ask for. Because of you, lots of kids at Ridgemont are safer. Thank you for being brave. I'm sorry I made you have to be. Tyler Brennan. Jake read the letter 3 times, searching for manipulation or self-serving narratives, finding instead what appeared to be genuine remorse from a child who was also trying to survive trauma and make sense of behaviors that had been normalized in his home environment. He showed it to Dr. Walsh, who confirmed that the language and sentiments were consistent with Tyler's documented therapeutic progress, that this represented meaningful growth even if it could not undo damage already done. He gave the letter to Lily with careful preparation, explaining that Tyler had written to apologize, that she did not have to read it if she did not want to, that her feelings about it were valid, whatever they turned out to be. Lily read it slowly, her face cycling through emotions too complex for a 7-year-old to fully articulate. When she finished, she folded it carefully and put it in the box where she kept important things. Her guardian angel pin photographs of Sarah drawings she had made in therapy. Do you want to write back? Jake asked gently. Not yet. Maybe someday. Lily's answer was thoughtful, considered. I'm glad he's sorry. I'm glad he's getting help. But I'm still mad at him for hurting me. Dr. Walsh says I'm allowed to be mad even if I also feel other things. You're allowed to feel however you feel, baby girl. Jake pulled her close. And you don't owe anyone forgiveness until you're ready. 6 months after the school board confrontation, Jake received a request from Tyler's therapist. Tyler had asked whether Lily would be willing to meet with him in a supervised setting, not for Tyler's benefit, but to give Lily the opportunity to speak directly to the person who had hurt her if she wanted that closure. Dr. Walsh supported the idea if Lily chose to participate, noting that victim-offender mediation could be powerful for trauma survivors and when done carefully and with appropriate safeguards. Lily thought about it for a week before agreeing. The meeting took place at a neutral location, a therapy office in Austin, where neither child had previous associations, with both Dr. Walsh and Tyler's therapist present, along with Jake and Tyler's aunt, who had custody of him since his mother's relocation. The room was set up carefully, chairs arranged so Lily and Tyler could see each other, but with enough distance that neither felt physically threatened. Tyler looked different than Lily remembered. Smaller somehow, though he had actually grown several inches. His hair was shorter, his clothes were clean but not expensive. His posture lacked the swagger that had made him seem larger and more dangerous in her memory. He looked like what he was, a 12-year-old boy who had been hurt and was trying to figure out how to stop hurting others. "I'm sorry I hurt you," Tyler said it simply without preamble or elaboration. "Really sorry, you made me scared all the time." Lily's voice was quiet but steady, words she had practiced with Dr. Walsh until she could say them without crying. "You made me think nobody cared about me. You made me eat off the floor." "I know." Tyler's response held no defensiveness, no excuses. "It was wrong. You didn't deserve it." "Why did you do it?" Lily asked the question that had been haunting her, the one that made sense of behavior that had felt random and inexplicable, even though it happened consistently. "Because my dad hurt me, and I didn't know how else to feel better except by hurting someone else." Tyler's honesty was stark painful to hear. "Because you were smaller than me, and I thought making you scared would make me feel less scared. But it didn't work. It just made me feel worse, and I didn't know how to stop once I started." They sat in silence for a moment, two children processing trauma that adults had inflicted on them directly or allowed to persist through negligence. Then Lily said something that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "I hope you get better. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just the simple wish that another person's suffering might end, that the cycle of hurt might be interrupted, even though interruption could not erase damage already done." Tyler nodded, tears streaming down his face, accepting the grace she offered without demanding more than she was ready to give. 8 months after the confrontation on a Saturday morning, when spring had transformed Texas from brown to impossibly green, the Hells Angels held a ceremony at the site where Sarah's bakery used to stand, a small storefront that had been converted into a community garden after the building was demolished following her death. 200 people gathered, far more than had known Sarah personally, but all of whom understood that her investigation and subsequent murder had sparked the transformation now flourishing throughout Ashford. Jake and Lily stood at the front beside a memorial stone that would be placed permanently in the garden center. The stone was simple granite engraved with words Jake had labored over for weeks before finding language that honored Sarah without reducing her to sentiment or platitude. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, 1981-23, baker, mother, truth seeker. She fought for children when no one else would. Her courage exposed corruption. Her sacrifice demanded justice. Her legacy lives in every child who walks safely through halls she helped make safe. Below the main inscription, a second smaller text: "Some people's deaths diminish the world. Others, like Sarah's, illuminate it. She showed us darkness so we would fight for light." Hawk spoke first, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Sarah Morrison was investigating corruption when it cost her everything. She gathered evidence knowing it put her at risk. She documented crimes knowing powerful people would want her silenced. And when they poisoned her, when they made her death look natural, she probably knew in her final days that she was being murdered and chose not to tell her family because she wanted to protect them from the same danger. He paused, letting that sacrifice settle. That's the kind of courage that changes the world. Not loud courage, not flashy courage. Quiet courage that says, "I'll risk myself so others will be safer." That's who Sarah was. That's why we're here. Elena Stitch Rodriguez spoke next, reading from letters written by families that Lily's legacy, the rechristened Angels Watch program, had helped in the 8 months since its inception. Children who felt safe for the first time. Parents who no longer feared retaliation for reporting problems. Teachers who could finally do their jobs without institutional pressure to ignore abuse. Each letter was testimony to ripples spreading outward from Sarah's choice to investigate rather than ignore, to document rather than accept, to risk rather than comply. Then Jake spoke, Lily standing beside him, holding his hand. "My wife died protecting children she never met. She could have looked away, could have decided it wasn't her problem, could have prioritized her own safety and her family's comfort. But she saw kids suffering, and she couldn't walk past that. She couldn't pretend it wasn't happening just because it was easier than fighting." His voice caught, but he pushed through. "I didn't know she was investigating. She hid it from me because she knew I'd try to stop her. And she was probably right. I would have told her it was too dangerous, that someone else would handle it, that our family came first. But she understood something I didn't, that we don't get to choose between our family and other people's children. That protecting one means protecting all of them. That her daughter wouldn't be truly safe in a world where systematic cruelty went unchallenged. He looked down at Lily, who wore her guardian angel pin as she did most days. So we're here to honor her, to remember her, and to promise that her death wasn't the end of her work. We're continuing what she started. Every child protected, every bully held accountable, every corrupt official exposed and removed from power. That's Sarah's legacy. That's how we keep her alive. They planted the memorial stone while 200 people stood in silence that felt sacred rather than empty. Around the stone, volunteers planted flowers that would bloom year after year, perennials, that would survive winter and return each spring as a reminder that some things endure beyond death, that some sacrifices bear fruit that outlast the person who made them. After the ceremony, as people filtered away to the reception at the Devil's Highway Diner, Elena approached Jake with something between nervousness and hope visible in her expression. I know this is complicated. I know it's maybe too soon, but I wanted you to know that if you ever want to talk, or if you need someone who understands what it's like to lose people you love and keep living anyway, I'm here. Jake looked at this woman who had given his daughter a guardian angel pin and who had worked tirelessly to build programs that protected children throughout Texas, this woman who had her own losses and traumas and had chosen to transform them into service rather than bitterness. Thank you. That means more than you know. They stood together in Sarah's garden, not quite ready to call what was developing between them romance, but recognizing that grief could coexist with the possibility of future joy, that honoring the dead did not require refusing to live, that Sarah herself would have wanted Jake to find happiness again, rather than treating her memory as prison that prevented forward movement. 1 year after Jake Morrison found his daughter eating lunch off a cafeteria floor, Ridgemont Elementary held a celebration that had nothing to do with the transformation that had occurred and everything to do with it simultaneously. The school's annual spring festival, traditionally a modest fundraiser that attracted maybe 100 people, had grown into a community-wide event that drew over 500 attendees. Food trucks lined the parking lot, bounce houses filled the playground, and at the center of it all, the Angels Watch volunteers stood in their leather vests, flipping burgers and running game booths and helping children navigate the chaos with practiced competence that had become familiar rather than frightening. Lily Morrison moved through the crowd with 3 friends who had become inseparable over the past year. Girls who had bonded through shared experience of discovering that adults would actually protect them if they reported problems, who had learned that asking for help was strength rather than weakness, who had internalized messages about their worth that would shape them into people who refused to accept cruelty as normal or inevitable. She saw a new student standing alone near the edge of the festivities, a boy, maybe 7 years old, with shoulders hunched in a posture Lily recognized immediately. She broke away from her friends and walked over, carrying the authority of someone who had survived and healed enough to help others survive. Hi, I'm Lily. Want to come play with us? It can be scary being new, but you're not alone here. The boy looked up, suspicion and hope fighting for control of his expression. Really? Really? Lily held out her hand. We look out for each other here. That's how it works now. As she led him back to her group, Jake watched from across the festival grounds, standing beside Elena, who had become increasingly important in his and Lily's lives over the past months. Not replacing Sarah, no one could or should do that, but creating new space for connection and care that honored the past while acknowledging that life continued forward, whether or not you chose to participate in it. She's good at that. Elena observed, watching Lily integrate the new student into her friend group with ease that suggested practice, making people feel welcome, making sure nobody's alone. She learned from the best. Jake's voice carried pride and grief in equal measure. Sarah would be proud of who she's becoming. Sarah would be proud of who you've both become, Elena corrected gently. You kept your promise to her. You protected Lily. And in doing that, you protected hundreds of other kids. The statistics supported Elena's assessment. In the years since Angels Watch had been implemented at Ridgemont, bullying incidents had dropped 82%. Physical altercations had declined from 45 per year to 0 in the past 8 months. Student attendance had increased 23%. Test scores had risen as children who had been expending energy on survival could redirect that energy toward learning. Teacher retention was at 100% for the first time in the school's history, with waiting lists for positions at a school that had previously struggled to maintain adequate staffing. The transformation had spread beyond Ridgemont. 12 Texas school districts now operated Angels Watch programs. 42 additional districts across 8 states had contacted the Hells Angels seeking information about implementation. 3 documentaries had been produced, including When Angels Ride, which won awards at multiple film festivals and sparked national conversations about community-based alternatives to institutional failure. And Sarah's Law had passed the Texas legislature with bipartisan support requiring independent audits of school board finances, protecting whistleblowers who reported corruption, and mandating that complaints about bullying or abuse be tracked in systems that prevented deletion or alteration. Other states were considering similar legislation inspired by a baker from Arizona who had died investigating crimes in Texas and whose murder had become catalyst for reform that would protect children she would never meet. Tyler Brennan's transformation was ongoing rather than complete, a work in progress that might take years or decades or a lifetime. But at 14, after 2 years of intensive therapy and education designed to help trauma survivors rather than simply contain them, he was demonstrably different from the 12-year-old who had tormented Lily. He volunteered at a youth center in Dallas. He spoke to groups of young people about cycles of violence and how they could be broken. He maintained occasional correspondence with Lily, letters that had evolved from apology to something approaching friendship, though they had not seen each other since that supervised meeting and might never have relationship closer than distant acknowledgement of shared history. His mother, Karen, had become an advocate for domestic violence survivors, speaking at shelters and support groups about her experience escaping an abusive marriage and finding safety through institutions she had been taught to fear. She had reconciled partially with Tyler, their relationship complicated by years of shared trauma, but also by shared commitment to healing. She would never fully escape the damage David Brennan had inflicted, but she had transformed that damage into purpose that helped others escape similar situations. David Brennan himself was serving his sentence at a federal prison in Oklahoma, isolated from the power structures he had built in Ashford, facing daily the reality that money and influence could not reach inside walls that treated all inmates with equal disregard for their previous status. He would die there. Everyone understood that. 25 years minimum before parole consideration at age 73, assuming he survived that long, assuming parole was ever granted to someone who had murdered to protect embezzlement and child abuse. His legacy was not the buildings he had developed or the donations he had made, but the corruption he had perpetuated and the lives he had damaged in service of maintaining power. On a Tuesday evening in early autumn, Jake Morrison sat on his porch swing with Lily beside him and Elena on his other side, watching the sun paint Texas sky in colors that seemed too vivid to be natural. Lily was 8 now, thriving in 3rd grade, captain of her school's reading club, and mentor to new students who needed guidance navigating social structures that could be cruel when left unchecked. She still wore her guardian angel pin most days. Still saw Dr. Walsh weekly, though the sessions had shifted from trauma processing to normal childhood development. Still had occasional nightmares, but they were decreasing in frequency and intensity. Daddy Lily's voice pulled Jake from contemplation. Do you think Mommy knows what happened? Do you think she can see that we made things better? Jake thought about Sarah, about her courage and sacrifice, about the investigation she had pursued, knowing it endangered her, about the legacy that continued spreading far beyond anything she could have imagined. I think she knows, and I think she's proud of you. Proud of the brave girl who stood up and told the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. I miss her. Lily said it simply without elaboration, the grief that would never fully disappear, but had become something she could carry rather than something that carried her. Me too, baby girl. Every single day. Elena reached over and took Jake's hand, the gesture both comfort and promise of future that honored past without being imprisoned by it. The 3 of them sat together as darkness gathered and as stars emerged, as Ashford transformed from the town that had failed Lily into the town that had learned from that failure and chosen to become better. Somewhere in a garden where Sarah's bakery used to stand, flowers bloomed around a memorial stone. Somewhere in Austin, legislators debated extensions of Sarah's Law that would protect even more children. Somewhere in Ridgemont Elementary, a teacher noticed a student being isolated and intervened immediately because the culture had shifted to one where adult responsibility meant actual protection rather than performative concern. And somewhere in 12 different Texas school districts and 42 more across 8 states, children walked into schools protected by Angels Watch volunteers whose presence announced that community was watching, that cruelty would not be tolerated, that every child mattered regardless of whose child they were or what their families could afford. The storm had passed, the angels had ridden, and in its wake, Ashford, Texas had been transformed from a place where corruption thrived in shadows into a community where light reached every corner, where children were protected rather than sacrificed, where one father's promise to his dying wife had catalyzed changes that rippled outward in waves that would touch lives for generations. Jake Morrison had kept his promise, had protected his daughter, had honored his wife's sacrifice, had demonstrated that courage looked like many things, like opening doors, like standing peacefully when violence seemed easier, like gathering brothers and sisters to defend the defenseless, like refusing to accept that institutional failure was inevitable or that powerful people were beyond accountability. And Lily Morrison, who had started this journey on her knees picking up scattered food while adults watched and did nothing, had become the girl who helped new students feel welcome, who stood up for friends being targeted, who understood that being brave meant feeling scared and acting anyway, who carried her mother's legacy forward every day through choices to cease suffering and respond rather than look away. The guardian angel pin glinted in the last light of day. 200 motorcycles sat in various garages and parking lots throughout Ashford, ready to ride again whenever justice required presence, whenever children needed protection, whenever the community called on angels to demonstrate that redemption was possible and that people dismissed as dangerous could be exactly what the world most needed. Jake pulled both Lily and Elena closer as full darkness settled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new children needing help, new systems requiring accountability, new opportunities to honor Sarah's memory through action rather than grief. But tonight was for rest, for gratitude, for recognition that they had survived something that should have destroyed them and had emerged stronger for the surviving. In the distance, a motorcycle engine rumbled. One of the brothers passing by, acknowledging their presence with sound that had once seemed threatening, but now felt like protection, like family, like the particular music of people who had chosen each other and chosen purpose over comfort and chosen to ride for justice, even when justice required patience and strategy rather than the violence society expected from them. The stars blazed overhead, ancient light from sources long dead, still reaching Earth to illuminate darkness, still providing navigation for people trying to find their way forward. And beneath those stars, in a small rental house on the outskirts of Ashford, 3 people who had lost much and found each other began the work of building tomorrow from the ruins of yesterday, of transforming grief into purpose, of proving that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most power to change the world, and that angels, when they choose to ride, can move mountains. The documentary When Angels Ride premiered at South by Southwest to standing ovations and immediate distribution deals. Critics praised its unflinching examination of institutional corruption and its nuanced portrayal of motorcycle club members as complex humans rather than simple stereotypes. Within 6 months, it had been viewed by over 20 million people worldwide, sparking conversations in communities far from Ashford about how to protect children when institutions fail them. Angels Watch expanded to 73 school districts across 15 states. The Hells Angels, Texas chapter, created a training program for chapters interested in implementing similar programs, teaching de-escalation techniques, child protection protocols, and the particular skills required to be visible, deterrence without becoming intimidating, presences that frighten the children they were meant to protect. Sarah's Law passed in 4 additional states and was under consideration in 12 more. The legislation had evolved to include provisions about mandatory reporting, training for all school employees, requirements that complaints be tracked in tamper-proof digital systems, and protections for students who reported bullying or abuse. Lily Morrison, now 9 years old, spoke at a state education conference about her experience. Her testimony was simple and powerful. Adults have to believe kids when we tell you something's wrong. You have to do something, not just say you will. Because every day you wait is another day a kid is suffering. The speech went viral, was quoted in legislation, was used in teacher training programs across the country. A 9-year-old girl whose voice had once been dismissed now spoke to audiences of thousands, her credibility born from survival and her authority derived from refusing to let trauma silence her. Jake Morrison and Elena Rodriguez married in a small ceremony at the garden where Sarah's memorial stood, understanding that Sarah would have approved of Jake finding love again. That honor for the dead did not require refusing life, but rather living fully in ways that made their sacrifices meaningful. Lily was Flower Girl, wearing her guardian angel pin, along with her dress, comfortable in a family that was neither traditional nor broken, but simply theirs. Tyler Brennan at 16 was accepted into a prestigious prep school with a full scholarship. His grades and his advocacy work and his documented transformation, convincing admissions committees that people could change, that mistakes did not have to define futures, that redemption was possible even for those who had caused significant harm. He maintained correspondence with Lily, writing every few months with updates on his life and expressions of continued gratitude for her role in his rescue from a path that would have destroyed him. And in Ashford, Texas, in Ridgemont Elementary, where this story began, a new generation of children learned that their voices mattered, that adults would protect them, that suffering was not normal or acceptable, that community meant everyone looking out for everyone else. They learned these lessons not from textbooks, but from lived experience, from seeing Angels Watch volunteers every morning, from knowing that if they reported problems, someone would actually address them, from understanding that the world could be better than it was and that they had power to make it so. The transformation was not complete, would never be complete. New challenges emerged constantly, new ways that power tried to protect itself, new children who needed advocates, new adults who needed courage to stand against institutional pressure. But Ashford had learned that change was possible, that ordinary people could hold extraordinary power when they chose to exercise it, that 200 motorcycles and one father's promise could reshape reality for thousands of children. Sarah Morrison's legacy lived in every child who walked safely through schools she had helped make safe, in every whistleblower protected by laws that bore her name, in every community that chose to implement protective programs modeled on what her sacrifice had sparked. She lived in her daughter, who transformed from victim to advocate, in her husband who had kept his promise and built something beautiful from grief, in a garden where flowers bloomed year after year as a reminder that some things endure beyond death. And on the anniversary of that first confrontation, when Jake and Lily and Elena placed new flowers at Sarah's memorial, they were joined by 200 Hells Angels and 500 community members and 3 news crews documenting the ongoing impact of a baker who had chosen courage over comfort and had paid the ultimate price for that choice. Some deaths diminish the world. Others illuminate it. The words on Sarah's memorial stone had proven prophetic. Her death had exposed darkness that could then be eliminated, had sparked transformations that continued rippling outward, had demonstrated that one person's courage could inspire thousands to find their own. The angels had ridden, the darkness had fled. And in the light that remained, children throughout Texas and beyond discovered that they were protected, that they were valued, that they were worth fighting for, even when fighting required patience and strategy, and the particular courage of standing peacefully when violence would have been easier. Jake Morrison, standing in Sarah's garden with his daughter and his wife, felt something approaching peace. The promise he had made 18 months ago had been kept. His daughter was safe. His wife's murder had been avenged through justice rather than revenge. And the corruption that had killed Sarah and tormented Lily had been exposed and eliminated, replaced by systems designed to protect rather than harm. Protect her. Whatever it takes, Sarah's final words to him, the promise that had shaped everything that followed. He had kept that promise, and in keeping it, he had protected not just Lily, but hundreds of children, had honored not just Sarah, but every parent who had ever lost a child to institutional failure, had demonstrated that love could be stronger than corruption, and that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. The sun set over Ashford, painting the sky in colors that seemed like benediction. And 3 people who had survived trauma and loss and systematic cruelty stood together in a garden dedicated to a woman who had died fighting for justice, grateful for her sacrifice, committed to honoring it, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought with the knowledge that they did not face it alone. The guardian angel pin glinted one last time in fading light. 200 motorcycles were parked throughout Ashford, their riders ready to defend the defenseless whenever the call came. And somewhere in the darkness, children slept peacefully, protected by systems built on courage and sacrifice. dreaming of futures that were possible because adults had finally chosen to prioritize their welfare over institutional convenience. When angels ride for justice, the world changes. One child at a time, one school at a time, one community at a time, until justice becomes normal rather than exceptional, until protection becomes standard rather than rare, until every child knows that their voice matters and that adults will believe them, and that suffering is not something they have to endure alone. That was Sarah Morrison's legacy. That was Jake Morrison's promise kept. That was Lily Morrison's future secured. And that was Ashford, Texas, transformed from a town that had failed its children into a community that would protect them forever.